vibe coding. This is a brand new term. What do you think it stands for?
Vibe coding is just you trying to figure out how the system should behave when you're prototyping. The good thing about vibe coding is you're able to basically iterate much faster with these agentic loops, that now you're just focusing on how would I actually achieve my outcome rather than the exact way to do it, because you can always change those details later. If you have the right abstractions, you could swap layers out. So I think that's changing the way people think about software, because if you're someone who has taste and knows this is the outcome I want to see on the UX, you may not even need to know a framework. You should experiment with it till it feels right. And of course, you need to massage it to make sure it doesn't make it harder to evolve later on. I think a lot of the software today gets you to the initial, it looks great, but then how do you maintain it is basically sort of left for a later time. And I think a lot of people who are still coding with AI are early in the prototype phase.
Gautam Korlam worked at Uber for almost 10 years, joining as Android engineer number 8, and was the founding engineer for the mobile platform team. He grew from software engineer 2 level all the way to principal engineer, and worked on developer experience and scalability challenges throughout his decade at Uber. Gautam is now the co-founder of Gitar, an agentic AI startup that automates code maintenance. In today's conversation, we cover how Gautam accidentally deleted Uber's Java monorepo, which had thousands of developers committing to it, Uber's in-house engineering tools like Monorepo, SubmitQueue, local developer analytics, and Devpods, AI's impact on software development, why vibe coding will spread, and why Gautam believes junior devs will thrive with AI tools. Uber's engineering culture is very unique, even across tech companies, and this episode is a perfect inside look of its early days. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe to the podcast on any podcast platform and on YouTube. Welcome to the podcast. It's great to have you.
Oh, thanks so much, Gagi. Glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
It's good to reconnect because we talked a lot while you were at Uber. But, you were on the platform team, and your work touched a lot of the systems that we worked on. Every engineer causes outages at Uber. I did it. People on my team did. What was a memorable outage that you might have caused accidentally or deliberately?
So this is a funny story. Towards the end of my career there, I accidentally deleted the Java monorepo at Uber. And there were thousands of devs committing this.
Yeah, the Java monorepo, that was one of we had two big backend monorepos, right? Go and Java.
Go and Java, yeah.
So this was after we did the migration on almost everyone using the Java monorepo.
Yeah, it was pretty funny because what the story is essentially, I don't think many people know about this because I recovered pretty quickly, but I was trying to test something out, like a test repo, and I was like, hey, I need to copy the git push command because we created the repos on push. So I copied the URL from the Java monorepo, but I forgot to change it. And then when I pushed, usually at Uber, they prevent you from force pushing, right? So, and it said, hey, I can't force push. And I didn't really read the message. Then I was like, why is this? I should be able to force push. And I did with some special flags. And there's only few people, maybe 3 people at Uber who can force push with that flag because I was part of the platform team and we didn't want anyone else to do it. And I pushed, and then someone pings me on Slack, hey, so the repo says initial commit. What's going on?
So you were a principal engineer at this point, right? You were one of the most senior people, and you were there for a long time, right? This is not some, you didn't know what was going on. So
yeah, that's why I had the permission to push.
So whole repo gone for until you reverted minutes later.
It was tricky
minutes?
because we had to get it back from a backup. Yeah, it was not too bad. It was a few minutes. And I think we had an incident review. It was luckily at a time when we had a submit queue. So the queue would pause automatically and said, hey, no work is lost, right? We had really good backups in place. So we reverted quickly. And I was like, got to be very careful with those copy paste commands.
Wow. Well, but I guess you tested the backup actually worked. You should have just said that. It was just a test. I wanted just to see if the process actually worked.
Yeah, chaos engineering.
This episode was brought to you by Sentry. Buggy lines of code and long API calls are impossible to debug, and random app crashes are things no software engineer is a fan of. This is why over 4 million developers use Sentry to fix errors and crashes and solve hidden or tricky performance issues. Sentry cuts debugging time in half. No more soul-crushing log sifting or vague user reports like, it broke, fix it. Get the context you need to know what happened, when it happened, and the impact, down to the device, browser, and even a replay of what the user did before the error. Sentry will alert the right dev on your team with the exact broken line of code so they can push a fix fast, or let AutoFix handle the repetitive fixes so your team can focus on the real problems. Sentry helped Monday.com reduce their errors by 60% and sped up time to resolution for Nextdoor by 45 minutes per dev per issue. Get your whole team on Sentry in seconds by heading to sentry.io/pragmatic. That is sentry.io/pragmatic. Or use the code PRAGMATIC on sign up for 3 months on the team plan and 50,000 errors per month for free. You reverted, thankfully, not like nothing crazy happened, but this is a pretty big deal. How can we imagine, like, what was the response of like your manager, the instant interview? I mean, yes, sure, you were an experienced engineer, but come on, this was a big deal, right?
So the good thing was, since we had the SubmitQueue, and we can talk about it a little bit more, only thing it affected was the amount of time it would take for a commit to merge onto main. So usually everything would get serialized. So all that it looked like was there was a little 20-minute delay while we recovered everything. And then everything just flowed naturally. So it was just like a random CI failure you would see, but we had so much recovery automated in place that it was almost a non-event. And the only SLO we broke was the latency SLO. No reliability SLOs were broken. So that was pretty good. Like, all the systems we put into place in the many years actually worked to save me that day.
Okay, and this is a good way to segue into the next one, Uber's unique engineering stack. I worked at Uber. I worked for a lot shorter time than you, but we overlap. You know, you were there when I started and you were still there when I left. Uber had a lot of unique systems. Can you talk about some of them and how they came about and why? Why did Uber build so much of its stack? Well, Uber, and also you built a lot of that stack, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So when I joined Uber in 2014, I was like Android engineer number 8, I believe, if I remember correctly. And there was no unit test. So I wrote the first unit test for the Android code base. Then I set up the Artifactory. Yeah, it was pretty funny. We were shipping so fast that people were just, integration testing using their mobile phones because it was just very, very fast growth.
This was in 2014, 2015?
2014 is when I joined, yeah. So then I brought in Artifactory so we could share stuff. And over time, what ended up happening was a lot of the stuff you take for granted today, the cloud native SaaS products for observability or hosting source code, were just not built for our scale back in the day. So we had to build a lot of stuff in-house to solve some very crazy problems. So we had commits going in almost one every minute, I think. And that might not seem like a lot, but when you have thousands of engineers working on code bases where you can easily go into merge conflicts, that was a big deal.
I hear a lot of companies saying it, or at the time it was popular to say it's not built for our scale. What was that scale? I mean, you mentioned the one commit per minute, which I can actually attest to that build systems could not handle, at least mobile build systems could not handle that. But what other scale was considered just like way bigger than what commercial vendors supported?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the build system part was definitely one because builds are taking just way too long. I think we embarked on like a big app rewrite, I think, when you were there. I think you talked about it before.
Helix.
It was funny. I was actually in Amsterdam and that happened in between. And then my boss calls me up, hey, this build time is like getting crazy. We need to somehow bring it under control.
Oh, that was you.
Yeah, I was there. And it was almost an hour something plus. So if we actually serialized all the commits one by one to make sure there was no merge conflicts, it would just take forever. And if we did not do that, our main branch would be red. We had this graph where it was like red, green, red, green, red, green. And it was impossible to work because there were so many teams trying to hit their deadlines. And you were depending on so much work from the other teams, like the networking library or the platform experimentation or a feature library from some other team. It was just not possible to do this without green main, essentially. So it's not just the build system time, but also the fact that when you push something, if you don't run tests against the other part of the code, then you're just not going to have a good time because you will just be stuck reverting stuff. Someone would be on call all the time. So it was a combination of factors that made it very hard to work with.
Yeah, and also like we did do that on that project specifically. We turned off end-to-end test, I think, for 2 or 3 days to speed things up, and it sped things up. And then we had so many regressions. And it took more time to, I think, for 2 or 3 days we turned it off, and for the next week everyone's fixing the regressions that kind of sneaked in underneath.
Yeah, I think we got a request at some point. Can you just turn off CI? And I was like, you know what's going to happen if we actually did that? And I had to really talk people down, saying you cannot just turn things off. It's going to make things worse.
So there was the SubmitQueue. Can we talk about what SubmitQueue was and why it was unique, at least initially to Uber? Even to this date, I'm pretty sure only a few companies have anything like that.
Yeah, I think SubmitQueue is essentially a way for you to guarantee a green main. So it's a way to kind of serialize your commits coming in and make sure that they play nicely with each other. There are some more open solutions now, but when we did it at the time, we had actually a paper that we published. It was fairly novel because we had very low tolerance for main being red. So we'd always want to guarantee a green main, which means we had to figure out how do we actually test changes coming in and make sure that the cross dependencies between different commits were considered. So it's just a way to kind of handle commits at scale and make sure that when everything merges, everything still builds with each other. Right? And that's a trickier problem than it sounds because we had to test things in combination, discard some paths, and do a lot of processing on the backend. But there was just one of the systems. I think we had to build a ton more, which I can talk about as well.
I was the consumer on this side. I was just using it. It was just a build system for me. But I didn't realize for quite a while that, because my team, the 10 of us who were working on it, we didn't really have merge conflicts with each other because we were working in different parts of the code. But it took me a while to appreciate that when I was pushing something, at any given time, there would be maybe 10, 20, 30 people on the same code base in mobile working, and each build would take 20, 30, 40 minutes. And then behind the scenes, I understood only when I read the paper that you were, looking, checking, is this code path in conflict? If so, which one should we build beforehand? There were all sorts of probability models. There's a bunch of math in that paper as well, right?
There's a lot of ML models too. I think we had to estimate what would potentially cause a failure and speculatively try to go on paths that might be green to try to optimize and then backtrack if we didn't make that goal, and we would make that model better over time. So it's quite interesting. I think if you didn't notice, that's a good thing. It means that it worked as it's supposed to do.
One thing that Uber did as an engineering practice was monorepos. Can you tell us how it started? Uber had multiple monorepos, but it all started with the iOS monorepo. And I recall you were there. Can you tell us how the decision was made to go from having a bunch of separate repos, initially on iOS, later on Android, and say all right, let's just do one big repository? And why did this happen, and what happened next?
So it's funny, I mentioned, I think early on, we didn't have tests. At that point, very, very early on, we had two apps, Rider and Driver, on both iOS and Android.
Yep.
And we had another repository called Library, which is the common components between the Rider and Driver app, which was just a submodule you would pull in. And it was really painful to pull in as a submodule. So we said, hey, let's set up some sort of Cocoa Parts Artifactory thing where you could download stuff from somewhere. But as we grew, we realized we couldn't put everything in one place. We had a networking team, experimentation team, a analytics focus team. They all wanted their own sort of nice little playground so they could experiment. So we went off and had hundreds of repos for a while, where everyone was just, unaffected by everyone else, could focus on their priorities and deliver. But then when you wanted to pull in these changes, let's imagine the networking library changed. You had to update networking, then the analytics library that relied on it, then maybe the experimentation, maybe some other feature library. It was really painful to upgrade and bump. And we were sort of on the hook because anything that the product teams don't do, the platform team ends up being the kind of catch-all. And you're like, hey, this is not going to scale. I think someone on the iOS team was like, hey, we should just go to a monorepo. It'll just take a weekend.
Famous last words.
I know, but they took a while. It didn't take a weekend, but the iOS team did it, and it was very effective for them. It was a lot of pain initially, and I think it happened at the same time they were moving to a new language, Swift, as well. So that was double whammy. They had to do both. They pulled it off, and the gains in productivity were massive because you don't have to go bump libraries because we were not an open source. Make sure the interfaces are nice for external consumption. It's one company, one code base. Why can't I update my library's public API and just update all consumers in one shot? It should be possible. So mobile did it, and then Android quickly followed suit. We actually froze the code for a weekend, and we moved everyone over. And it was painful at the start because the build systems, as I mentioned, were not meant for hundreds of modules in a repository. We upstreamed some changes to Google to make it better. And then after a while, we migrated to a new build system, Buck, from Facebook at the time. And we wrote some auto conversion from the existing system to the new system. So we had both at the same time. That was really successful because once things were fast, the NPS improved again. Monorepo was good. So the gist is Monorepo, non-Monorepo, if you don't have tooling, it's going to suck. You at a bigger scale, you have to invest in tooling. As your companies grow, typically this need becomes more and more obvious as things start slowing down. Right? And then later we had the Java Monorepo, and we migrated over to Bazel, and we had the Go Monorepo. And I think what we realized with the Monorepo was that the main thing that helped us do was it was standardized, which meant to make a big change, one team could go do it. Like a centralized team could just take the burden of updating this one networking library for everyone, or updating Google Play services for everyone. You just cannot do that in like hundreds of repositories. It's just very wasteful amount of work, right?
And what was the biggest pushback that the teams initially had? Because I remember the mobile ones, that they actually happened, and it was, like very practical. But then when the Java and the Go was happening, I remember a lot of teams were dragging their feet, like, I'm not sure we want to do this. It's gonna, slow things down. Do you remember what the biggest, skepticism was, and then how it turned out?
Yeah, the biggest skepticism is usually right now, before Monorepo, I could break an API and not worry about it. The tax is paid by someone eventually, right? It's just deferred. It still needs to get paid. But with the Monorepo, if I do it, I have to think about my interface design more, and my builds are going to be slower, was the argument. With the new build system, we kind of said, hey, the builds are not going to be slower. But people would always come up with reasons saying, hey, if I did this upgrade, then I have to do it for everyone. So we said, okay, you know what? We will make it possible for you to just upgrade your part of the code in some scenarios, but otherwise we want to have everyone be standard. It does make things a little slower, but then as a business, it makes a ton of sense because you might not see the macro picture on your team that, yeah, you might be slow a little bit, but everyone else gets like a huge productivity boost because they didn't have to spend the time you did on each and every one of those teams to like get up to speed.
Yeah, so is it safe to say that monorepos often, not always, they bring kind of a almost necessary friction where like making certain changes will be painful because they should be painful, like because when they were not painful, they were masking something down the road of, let's say, I update a dependency to something else, and then it has to trickle down. Otherwise, you'll have these problems, but they'll only come out in weeks or months later.
Yeah, to be fair, like you can also do stuff without the monorepo. Like I know companies like Amazon, Netflix do multi-repo setups, but they build tooling specially to handle those cases where you have golden version sets that work with each other. It's a little bit like a monorepo without being a monorepo, right? So you can make both work, but monorepo is just generally easier, in my opinion, just having considered both. But if you want to go the other route, you absolutely can. You still have to invest either way as your code base grows.
And what were some other kind of novel / innovative things that, it sounds like you had to invent some of these things at Uber because there was just not a solution that you could buy, or it was just really expensive, or not, for not built for this use case. Absolutely.
So the other thing I think which is interesting for us is, as I mentioned, build times are a problem. We only knew because we first had to measure it. I think back in the day, a lot of the measurement products for developer observability were just not built for the entire SDLC. So what I mean by that is like you might have like a CI Jenkins back in the day that would tell you how long your builds would take, but you had no idea how much your indexing time would be on your IDE. And we had very complex projects, or you had no idea what was the time between pushing and code review. So we built a system at Uber called Local Developer Analytics. We call it LDA for short, which was like a little daemon that used to run on your machine, collect information about your system, like what's your CPU usage, memory usage, but also like integrate deeply into a lot of the CLI tools, the IDEs. So we would, for example, know when you opened your project, which file you went to, which part of the file you were actually like coding the most, which files would have the most bugs. And then you could also see like a funnel, like in a traditional product funnel, because we care about like developers as like a end user. you would see like analytics saying, hey, there was a drop in the funnel. People could not create PRs because this part of the build process would error out more often than the others. So you would go and like know what to target. And it was fairly novel because I gave it a few talks at a few different conferences, and not even big companies had something like this back in the day. And I think we still use that today to power a lot of the dashboards and the deep analytics that we get from the developers' workflows.
Yeah, like what do most, like you've been in the developer productivity, you talk with a lot of people and know a lot of people, but what do most companies do? Do they just like ask developers, like, how does it feel? Or
I think that's a very important thing to do for sure, because even if you have all the measurement, if the development doesn't feel right to you, you still want to ask that. Like you want to have a survey, which we did. In fact, when I remember when we started doing the surveys, I think we had like an NPS score negative 50 something, and when I left, it was like positive 8 or something like that. So I call that as a win, that we did a lot of effort. So you do your survey as the very first step, which we did, but then you measure the easier things like your commit, time to like review code or time to like build code, stuff that's out of the developer's control. You want to like minimize, and also time spent in meetings. Like those are things that you could probably get easily. Mm-hmm. But the deeper stuff is only worth it if you see that those bottlenecks are adding up. Like if you're making changes, but you're not seeing like people are happier, because you'll always see developers complain build times are slow or ID indexing is slow. That's when you know, okay, we need to measure things. But now I think products like VS Code, JetBrains have better analytics. I think we worked with JetBrains, for example, in trying to make them understand, hey, these are some of our problems. It'll be great to have solutions out of the box for these. And some of those did make it upstream into products that everyone uses today. So we call that as like, we kind of had to forge our own paths, and then eventually all the vendors would catch up based on what the industry was doing.
Yeah, but it's interesting how back then there was nothing, and you kind of like pinpointed. I guess one advantage that Uber always had is we had a lot of developers, and there was actually a dedicated, what was your team's name? Was it developer platform?
We were called developer experience. They had multiple names. I think we were mobile infra first, then mobile developer platform, then developer platform. That was the final name we had. But funnily, actually, the team was not that big. My team was about 10 people, and we supported about 1,000 engineers, and that's roughly the breakdown. So you would see that speaking to peers in the industry, the team sizes are about the same. You have like a very small core centralized team, and then you have a much bigger product organization that they support. So it's very common, and that means that you have to find ways to scale yourself and be effective.
And then there was another project that I remember that was just taking off just in my last year. It was called Devpods. What was that?
So I think a lot of people might have heard the term cloud developer environments or developer environments in the cloud. So we call these Devpods, and what it is essentially is a container of your code, your build system, artifacts, your IDE indices in the cloud. And what we did at Uber was fairly unique in the sense that we figured out some ways to make it boot really, really fast and have pretty much everything pre-indexed. And it is one of the most loved products there, because you could essentially multiplex yourselves now. Rather than trying to switch branches, re-index your code or context switch, you could have 10 different Devpods working on different features, and they could have everything warm. You could context switch quickly. You could kick off a build and go do something else. It was actually great. I think we put a lot of engineering effort to make that scale really well. And it was a fairly small team as well. Actually, a bunch of those folks are still in Amsterdam now working on the product.
And can you just explain? Because I think most companies just do not have anything like that. Like as a developer, what can I imagine? Like okay, I joined Uber, Devpods is there. What does that mean for me? What can I do?
When you onboard, previously we used to have this like bootstrapping script you would run. It's funny because at Gitar we do this now. We have a bootstrap shell script that everyone just keeps updating.
There was a shell script, and then which usually worked well, but sometimes it crashed, and then we would have to, ping the on-call of your team. But it was a pretty involved script. Like it would take sometimes minutes to run. There's a lot of magic complex under the hood.
And the problem with that is like it's hard to keep it forward and backward compatible with your system updates on Mac. So it was definitely like not worth maintaining over time. But the Devpods is interesting because I think just when we started seeing some of the solutions like VS Code Remote or JetBrains Projector become a little bit more mainstream, we said, hey, why don't we move this development stuff into a container it should be easy, right? But it's actually much more than that. These containers can be huge, multiple gigabytes, right? Because some of these artifacts and indices are huge. We had to make sure we also use compute efficiently. So we would have to have multi-tenant, because developer workloads are very spiky. They don't always have like a stable pattern like a server workload, which means that you have to like understand when to scale up and down. We have developers in different time zones. So we have to also like provision machines closer to them. So the build caches would be warm, closer to where they are working. Otherwise, you don't upload everything from a data center in the US, but you might be working in India and the latency would be really bad. It's a lot more nuanced, I think, than just spinning up a container. A lot of the solutions out there now are just focusing on containerizing stuff, but not thinking through a lot of these other factors that are important. So we went through and made a lot of improvements here. Some of that stuff actually, one of the funny things I remember is, I think JetBrains had this like one shared index thing that they had a while back where you could download an index of the project. But I think the way they were doing it previously, you would have the full path of the system in the index. So you would download a denormalized path and then you would normalize it to your system. Just populating all the absolute paths would take a really long time. We measured it was like take an hour to actually like index that shared index for JetBrains. But then on Devpods, what we did, we just said, hey, everything's in our control. Let's just put everyone at home user. So it'll be like closing the laptop and opening it again. So we could just throw the cache there. Everyone was at home user. So now no more like time spent like denormalizing the cache, which meant we had like a 6-second boot up, which is pretty insane for like a dev environment. So you would come in, you would say Devpods start something and you're done. You don't need to do any bootstrapping, nor learn something. And you would have one flavor per monorepo you would work on. So a data engineer or like a backend engineer or a mobile engineer would have their own flavor. And that's very optimized for that workflow.
So it's basically you go in and say like Devpods start, and then in a few seconds you have your your local editor. You're using your local editor, but it's kind of like connected magically from your perspective. So you feel like you're working locally, but it's just all set up. It works. You can build immediately. You can run your tests, etc.
Yeah, you would have like lots of cores as well. So you could run a lot faster than running it locally.
That's pretty awesome. I previously did a deep dive on cloud-based development environments, I think 2 years ago. One thing I'm noticing is there's not much talk about these things, even though they're just so darn efficient. Do you see kind of excitement in this space, or is just AI right now, blurring everything out? Because this to me, this was a really big win.
Yeah, I think the environments are still good. I think a lot of companies do want to use this for efficiency's sake. The challenge usually comes with, I think the understanding that I have talking to peers in industries, if you start with the solution rather than the developer workflow, hey, we have a container environment, make it work for your developer workflow, versus you have a particular way to work, let's make it work in a container or VM. So we took the other approach, and that is why we were so effective. We were like, hey, these caches have to be like super fast to load. Other stuff can come in async. Right? And not everyone would have that insight. If left to their own devices, teams might devise a Docker file that has stuff, but then how are you getting it up to date? As your team churns out more code, are your indices actually getting up to date? Otherwise, you're spending a bunch of time after bootstrapping to re-index stuff or re-download stuff. So we would push these updates every few hours completely transparently in the background. So it was very much like a golden path that we had to like kind of happen upon. And that's why I think if you have that knowledge of the entire developer workflow, you can adapt it to each company's individual working style. If you give a general purpose thing, it'll work, but may not actually work so well out of the box, and you may not have the investment you may want to make to make it work for you.
Yeah, it sounds like there's no free lunch. You need to put in the work, and Uber had like so many years and of like understanding investing, like being there. Speaking of years, you spent 9 years at Uber, and when you joined, you were an Eng II. Is that right? Or
yes, I was an Eng II when I joined.
And Eng II,
I guess, yeah. I don't know what is the lowest level, whatever the lowest level was.
Yeah, and then you when you left, you were a principal engineer, which is there's not many principal engineers, like several, like a few dozen or something like that. So yeah, and you were promoted.
Actually, yeah, maybe a couple dozen. Yeah, not that many.
Out of the closer to 2,000-3,000 people working in tech. And so you were promoted, I think I counted 4 or 5 times in 9 years. Can we talk about your journey? Like how did you do it, and what did you learn on the way?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the cheat codes is obviously joining early helps a lot, especially if you're getting on a rocket ship. But it's hard, right? Because when I joined, we didn't have as many people. The platform teams were tiny. It was so small. It was funny because I jumped straight from entry level to senior. So I skipped a level because the first year was just put through the paces of we need to get a lot of stuff done, and I was shipping really fast. So that helped, obviously, one jump up. But it gets harder over time. I think your roles also change a lot over time. I think one of my good friends early on in the platform team said, hey, if you can get into a niche and go deep, it can really help over long term, especially stuff that people may not want to do. Like developer platform, developer tooling, not everyone likes to do it. But if I said, hey, I really like this because I'm passionate about it, that helps because then you become the go-to person for that aspect. So as the company grew, it was very obvious that, hey, I had to scale myself to larger and larger efforts. So starting on mobile, then I started working on backend stuff, and then on more holistic entire organization stuff. And that takes like kind of, breaking your own comfort zone a lot, like challenging yourself every year or two. So every 2 years, I kind of do some introspection and say, hey, am I doing what I want? Do I enjoy what I'm doing? What can challenge me more? And then I try to go for that. And usually the path opens up if you go that way rather than trying to chase like a particular level. Because then when you're pushing the boundaries, the next level kind of becomes obvious. And past a particular point, it just also helps to have a lot of connections, like social capital, mentorship. Those are very important at like a big company, right? So I definitely went and got some mentorship with some more senior folks. That helped a lot to understand how these principal engineers operate, and what's required is more than just the engineering, it's also the business side of things. How do we actually solve problems and focus on like the business metrics and bring that to engineering rather than start from bottom up.
And when you say, like you need to get some social capital and mentoring, like it can sound a little bit of hand wavy to people of like, okay, but how did you get that? I'm not going to ask how you went about it, but because it sounds like you didn't say like, oh, I want to get social capital, but what were things that you did that you think actually helped build up and people saying, oh, like Gautam, I really trust this person. I know him. He's a go-to person, etc.
Yeah. So one thing that helps is I have this habit of just helping people a lot. So when people come to me with like a problem with their dev environment, I would just drop everything and say, hey, let's try to figure it out. I'll spend a little bit of time box it. And if it fixes the problem, then I have some social capital. It kind of accumulates over time because they would send someone else to you. And over time, you can automate some of this stuff. And I think I was one of the early people on the platform team to have office hours. So I would say, hey, anyone can come in and just, talk about your problems. And we would, just empathize a lot with everyone. Say, hey, I know this sucks. We're working on it. It helps a lot to humanize the problem, right? Because developers just usually ping you on Slack. And over time, what happens is like, as you solve more and more problems, it's always good to like attempt. And even if you can't meet the expectation, just say, hey, I can't solve this right now. Then try to say, okay, that's not in my area, right? Let me just try to help you out. And that really helps build trust with the other side. And then when you go for mentorship, it's like, hey, I clearly know you have the right sort of like mindset, you have the right goals in mind or like the right intentions. So I would love to help you kind of go to the next level. So that's usually what helps get very strong mentorships.
Yeah. And I can just plus one a little bit on the helping people because, I was in Amsterdam, which is, we say it's a distributed site, but we were just not an HQ. We're a relatively small office, like compared to SF or even Palo Alto in headcount. And we felt a little bit isolated. And sometimes, like a lot of times, we would feel blocked by SF in reviews and in anything. And after a while, I knew that if I wanted to, you were one of the many people on the platform team, but I think either someone told me, like, there was this thing, like, if you cannot reach anyone on the platform team, try Gautam. Like, he usually responds. And just thinking back, it was just wild to me that, like, I did get responses from, sometimes in unexpected. Like I didn't think I would get anything. I was just trying, but you did like spend time on this, and I just imagined that you had a lot of these things. And I'm not saying you necessarily did it all the time, and obviously people like me were doing it sparingly, but it built so much goodwill and also trust of like, wow, like I just felt that whenever you did go on a problem, you actually took it seriously. Like you kind of did it, and as you said, often you would tell like, I cannot do this right now, or it's a non-issue, etc. So I didn't see everyone. In fact, I saw pretty few people doing it. So like it's interesting how it feels like something that would not scale. But I guess to some extent it did. Is this like the startup mentality of like, do things that don't scale?
Yeah, I think it definitely doesn't scale in all cases, but you can make it work. I think it's funny because some people won't even try because it won't scale. My suggestion is like, hey, let's meet the person and see. It may not even be an issue, right? Sometimes what you might discover is people are just finding it hard to find the right documentation because they just looked at the wrong guide, and that's where they're coming to you. Then you can just go make that fix, and then you have much larger impact. But if you don't talk to people, you have these broken windows. Like you have the big picture, but then you lose touch of what's actually happening on the ground. It's hard. So I think my policy was always like, hey, I can always talk to someone, spend a few minutes, and if it's like a very esoteric thing, I'll say, hey, I can get back to you. But if it is not, I would rather just point you the right way. People joke when I left because they're like, hey, we should go build Gautam LLM because he would know the answers to like, pointed things at least so that we could find the right information. So I was sort of like an encyclopedia of where to find stuff.
And you were a principal engineer towards the end of your tenure at Uber. What is a principal engineer at Uber? And also previously we had an episode at Meta. Meta has archetypes above staff engineer. Do you think you fit into an archetype, or did you see kind of archetypes at the principal level at Uber?
Yeah, I did listen to that episode. It's a very good episode, by the way. I think there is some resemblance to an archetype, although we don't actually call it that. So either you have depth in a particular area, or you have a lot of breadth. And sometimes it's a lot of internal influence, or you might have a lot of external influence, right? So it really depends on where you want to take your career. I focus a lot on depth. Like, as you can see, my specialization is like developer productivity, and I have some amount of breadth because of all the social capital, and talking to a lot of people usually makes you understand what are some of the business problems that Uber is going through. So that was actually a good bonus for me, because if I never talk to people, I won't even know, oh, these 3 teams are trying to solve the same problem. Maybe we can centralize it or do it more efficiently, and I could come up with solutions. And people will be like, hey, how did you know like that would work? Because you just talk to people. Right? And there were definitely like lesser archetypes probably than Meta, I would say. But usually it's a bunch of breadth and depth, and having people to sponsor you helps a lot. So the mentorship angle is also part of that. If you're working with more senior engineers and they see you actually grow, they can give you feedback where you might be lacking, and you might be able to kind of work towards that goal. So I think that's one of the things I would recommend anyone who wants to go down that path. With principal engineering, it's a lot more, you have to enjoy like understanding how engineering meets business than just pure coding or just pure, not soft skill stuff. A lot more soft skills need to be honed at that point. It's like going and giving talks helps. And it's funny because when I was growing up, I was not very good at public speaking, but I made myself over time more comfortable. That helps also like build external influence. And a lot of the early folks that are using our product right now are people I met in the community, and then they kind of have that trust that they built over time. So that helps. So
this is a lot of people who are using your product right now at Gitar, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess that's a good reminder of like how it's when you're doing something, it might, hopefully it'll help you outside of when you're at your current company, and also help you while you're at the company.
Yeah, my tip is generally, if you really focus on the people side of things, you'll do really well in these higher levels, because it's a lot of relationship management, both managing up and down, and shielding your team from some of the noise. And if you don't enjoy talking to people, it's harder. I mean, you can still do it. There are people who do it, but it's a very unique path, and not everyone can do it. But the most common path is usually like understanding and spending time, like talking to people and figuring out solutions that are more creative over time. And that also kind of makes you a problem solver, not just like someone who can just, code and finish up things up. But that's, of course, like you can have different archetypes, as you mentioned. So it really depends on where you want to take things.
Yeah, but I guess at the principal engineer level, it's kind of a given that you can code efficiently whenever and however. It's just like you might not do it all the time by choice, right?
It's funny because there was a graph someone sent me of like number of years at the company and number of commits per year and number of reviews. And there was like a little graph, like, like an asymptotic graph. And there were 2 or 3 dots at the very extremes. And then said, hey, one of them is me, the other one is you. Then I was like, damn, I should ask my boss for a raise.
So you were still writing a lot of code and doing a lot of reviews?
I do write a lot of code. Even here at Gitar, I write a ton of code. I love to review stuff because it really opens up your perspective of what else is happening, right? I like to comment on documents and understand where there are inefficiencies potentially. But it just, over time, I think you have a muscle to just do it. But it does not mean that you write tons of code. It just means that you have consistent, higher impact code.
So a really interesting topic is, given that you're a principal engineer, which was either the highest level or maybe there was one level above it, but there weren't many levels above that. How was it like for your manager to manage you? And I know you also talk with a lot of principal engineers and you have some thoughts on what are some tips to manage these very, very senior engineers? Like, can you help explain your relationship with your manager? Was it really a kind of a boss or more of a partnership? And what worked at this level?
I think that's a really good question because I think as you grow in levels, you're more and more sort of like a peer to your manager. You help your manager get stuff done too because you have broader influence. Sometimes it can be hard as an EM to, like push for a particular priority because there's not enough senior people that can back, right? It might be just your director level person that's sponsoring that. But having someone on the team that's senior enough can completely change the odds, for example, to get something prioritized. One tip I will give managers is like if someone's asking you, hey, I'm at a senior staff or I want to become a principal, after like the senior levels, if they come ask you, it's hard. You should probably not ask that question to a manager because at some point you will have to figure things out, right? There's very few managers who probably can help you after a particular point because they're maybe done it before or have a lot of experience at the company. But most managers tend to work at like senior or senior plus level. And past that, it's more like they're almost like the principal engineer on the team is load balancing a lot of stuff technically. So the manager can focus on up-leveling everyone else. So the relationship is very much like a peer, like more than like, hey, just a boss. But it does help to get feedback. I think their managers are a very good asset when you want to do non-engineering stuff. Like, for example, you want to get stuff unblocked and the engineering angle is not working because you try to rationale with some team, they won't listen. Sometimes you just got to take the, hey, this is the priority, we need to get this done, like unblock yourself. So that's what I would say for EMs who might be looking at higher level engineers. Basically, give them agency. But of course, like check in often and make sure that they're unblocked, right? Because they can do wonderful things as long as your org is not getting in the way from them trying to actually have impact.
Yeah, this is always interesting because I don't think we really talk about this too much just because there's not many of these engineers. But even when I was a manager, I actually promoted someone, actually 2 engineers, a level above where I was, right? I mean, it was a bit easier for me because I saw examples, but it's always interesting, and I feel it kind of goes hand in hand. Like for these things, those promotions really help usually the manager as well. And as you said, for a lot of managers, it's a first, and there's no playbook after senior or staff. It's all unique. It's all based on the business needs for the company in that specific area.
But if you're able to keep up with the engineer, then they can pull you up as well with them because then you can become higher level and you can focus on bigger picture stuff because you hear a lot of stuff from an org or a company perspective from the engineers because just talk to so many people, then you might have opportunities that you may not have if you're solely focused on your team.
Before we jump back into the episode, I want to let you know that the audiobook version of my best-selling book, The Software Engineer's Guidebook, is out now. You can get it on all major audiobook platforms like Spotify, Audible, Libro.fm, Apple Books, Google Play, and also DRM-free MP3 files. I started writing this book after a decade of working as a software engineer when I was working as an engineering manager for a few years already at Uber. Here's a review from the book from senior principal engineer Tanya Reilly, who is the author of The Staff Engineer's Path. From performance reviews to P95 latency, from team dynamics to testing, Gergely demystifies all aspects of a software career. This book is well named. It really does feel like the missing guidebook for the whole industry. You can get the book at engguidebook.com or search for the Software Engineer's Guidebook on your favorite audiobook platform. I hope you'll enjoy it. One thing we just kind of mentioned as natural is that you always worked on a platform team. But when you started, I'm pretty sure there was not yet a platform team. And then there was a split called the platform program split. It was a very famous email that I think later we saw. I only read it. Can you talk about what was before there was platform and program teams, and how did this split actually play out from your perspective?
Yeah, so I remember when I was interviewing to join Uber, they asked me, hey, what do you want to do? You want to do some platform stuff? I said, I want to build tools for developers. And they're like, okay, you're hired, because no one wants to build tools for developers. The longer version is the platform team sort of existed. We just used to call it, I think mobile had it first, but then the other ones. We just had unofficial platform teams. They were working on core infrastructure pieces. The platform teams were essentially made so that the other teams could move faster and not duplicate stuff, right? There's a lot of stuff that goes into building features, and mobile was just very new back in the day. So things were just not as well figured out as they are today. So you had to build a ton of stuff internally. So and if you're doing this on every team, then it's a lot of waste. So I think when we decided to do the platform program split, we said program teams don't need to worry about a lot of the underlying layers. Similar to a cloud native environment, you worry about your business logic, your product metrics, and we'll give you all the building blocks, which could be a mix of open source wrapped in our own layer and our own architecture that makes so that you don't mess with the other features, because everyone has their own way of building banners or their own way of styling things, not at all consistent for a app like Uber. You need to have a common design language, so you need to use common components. Stuff you would do on a website or take for granted today just didn't exist on mobile, right? So it had to be done that way to kind of make things move faster, so you don't have to rebuild another widget or rebuild another analytics processing thing and do something in the backend.
So one pain point, or I wonder how big a pain point is, but one thing that looked challenging to me, I was not on the platform team, I was your customer, but we always pinged you with questions. And as you mentioned, a year ago or so, there were 10 engineers for about 40,000 engineers. What did support look like, and what practices did you figure out? Because I saw a lot of practices like office hours, on-call rotations on where to ping, etc., that I have not seen anywhere else. The platform teams were advertising these things. It was almost I don't know, like having a vendor almost. They were contracts. They were actually SLAs. It was published how fast you can expect things, where to escalate, how to tack something with high priority, etc. I've never seen anything like this. And how did you figure out support, and how important was it?
Yeah, so the angle that I think we thought about was hey, for everyone else, the end user is the customer. For us, the developer is the customer. Let's not treat it as another internal thing. Let's really be customer obsessed. That was the value we had at Uber, that we extremely focused on the customer experience. Developer experience for us is the customer experience, which means imagine if your Uber didn't show up, you'd be very upset. So if your build didn't finish, exact same feeling. Okay, I cannot ship my code, right? So we need to make sure that there is reliability and latency guarantees for that exact same reason. So all the product, I think minded folks had very much honed in on product analytics. We said, hey, let's think about what is important for the developer. So we asked them things like build time. They said, hey, I want to make sure my CI is reliable, has no flaky tests. Can you make sure the flaky tests are not blocking me? Because it's expensive with the build cut. You have to chase the release train, and that's not fun. I'm sure you've seen your team complain about hey, I had this flaky test. I had to resubmit this diff, and that's not going to merge in time for the release train.
Yeah, and just staying late. I'm not sure. I think the release train left on Wednesday night. So Wednesday night was the cutoff. And or morning, I'm not sure, but I know people stayed longer on those days to catch the release train, meaning getting their PR, as we call the diff, merged on there. Yeah, it was, as you say, it was a big deal. I didn't actually realize that you were obsessing about it, but it kind of makes sense because after a while it wasn't an issue.
Yeah, because that's when people complain a lot that, hey, I tried to catch the train, but then something was out of my control. The infrastructure was flaky. So we missed this deadline. Now I'm on the hook as a platform team to ensure a hotfix happens, which means a bunch of other teams are going to get disturbed because they have to retest all their workflows. It has a lot of ripple effects, right? And these are not obvious unless you think about, we cared about testing because the end user will see the impact if you don't test all these features again.
Yeah.
Right. So for us, actually, the metrics were very important to have. Like we would have SLOs, we would publish them, we would try to keep them, we would review if we missed them, and then do incidents management and retrospectives so we could avoid those. A lot of the good tooling came out of that was to ensure high reliability, low latency, which means you could ship product really fast as a company, and the infrastructure would not get in that way. Right? And that is why some of those metrics you see matter, is because once we actually talked to the developers, we knew what actually mattered to them. That's what we focused on.
So is it just, I'm just thinking about this, but is it safe to say that, I think we can agree that the platform team or the developer experience team at Uber did a great job, but they did a great job because you ran it like a product team. Like you, as you said, you talk with the customers, you figure it out how to map how they feel or what they care about into metrics. You then monitor those metrics, and then you kept iterating on these things. Like if I replace this with a paying customer, it's the same thing, right? Like that's what a great product team does.
Absolutely. You have to run it like a product org, because then the incentives are good on both sides. Because if the developer doesn't like the product, then you should kind of be like, okay, what do I do to make it better? So if the company is shipping high quality product, then we should also ship high quality product for our developers. And that's how we took pride in making sure that our developers could deliver to the end user. So yeah, you're absolutely right. The metrics, I think a lot of people might focus about at a high level, may not be enough. You're right. You have to talk to people. You have to look at the funnel. Where are people dropping off? Things like the onboarding, for example, for new engineers. Where would they have difficulty? Like the Devpods, for example, was hey, people would go look at these outdated docs and they would try to set up an environment and then just spend a lot of time. So having a Devpod just eliminates that. And then later, you might have a situation where a build failed and there's a very easy quick fix. You should automate that. You should not ask the user to go to it. If there's a linter failure, in my opinion, we've failed, because a lint should not complain. It should either fix or not. Just telling them, hey, there's a problem is not going to do anything. You're so much pressure to ship product that if it's not blocking me, I will merge anyway, right? So if it's blocking me, if it can be auto-fixed, why can't you auto-fix, right? That's kind of how we took things.
I like that. What is your take on measuring developer productivity? Your team was called Developer Experience. I'm sure developer productivity came in. This is a very heated topic these days. It seems like for the past few years, and there's a lot of back and forth of what can you measure, what can you not measure. Should you measure diffs per engineer or per team? You probably thought a lot about this or have been in the middle of this. What worked and what didn't?
Yeah, so I think the very first thing we measured was just sentiment. So talking to developers, as I mentioned, the NPS survey was very easy because it was a very quick signal to see if things are in the right spot. If everyone's super happy, then there's no problem, but that's rarely the case. There's always, problems that pop up. I think as you mature your measurement, I think a lot of the frameworks we see out in the open are sort of inspired by what Uber did early on and took some of the good picks out. I think when people talk about diffs per engineer, they're not really saying, hey, you should commit more diffs per engineer. Is something preventing you from moving as fast as you could potentially? Because I can tell you that engineers, if basically nothing blocked them, would love to write code, right? If you're an engineer, you want to ship code, you want to feel proud about what you shipped. There's no one who will come in and say, hey, I don't want to write these many diffs. I want to write code because it makes me happier, right? And what we were looking at those signals was, hey, do you have too many meetings? Do you not have focus time? Because devs were usually a matter of focus time. So when we improved that, we saw focus time improved. I think when we had COVID, everyone was working from home. The devs per engineer shot up and everyone thought that, hey, people are working so hard. It is amazing. It's just because people just didn't have too many meetings initially. And over time, when everything went to Zoom, it kind of came back again down a little bit, right? It's usually a way to make sure that your infrastructure is letting people move as fast as they can. And as you remove roadblocks, you're focusing on the right things. And in fact, actually, one of the things we measured is time for code review, more than anything else, the time to review was the biggest bottleneck. Because as you mentioned, you would put up a PR in Amsterdam, might wait for review from SF. That's already like a 10-hour delay.
Yeah.
And I think the P90s were pretty crazy. Like it would take days to get code reviewed, right? And that would just be the biggest blocker more than anything to like ship product. And honestly, like CI time is like a blip compared to the amount of time it takes to review, right? So in the big picture, I think we work to improve turnaround time by nudging people, by auto-approving PRs that had minor changes that semantically would not change the meaning or the behavior of the PR. That helped a lot because you didn't have to get another approval for making like a comment fix, or you're doing a small stylistic change, for example. So that helped kind of unblock a lot of those scenarios. We had auto-approve or auto-land, which helped because if your reviewer approved, then it would merge immediately. So you don't have to rebase and worry about conflicts. A lot of these kind of small things can actually have a really big impact. But if you don't measure, you wouldn't know. So I think in terms of developer productivity, when you talk to your engineers, they might say, hey, I feel less productive because I can't do something. Then your metrics should flow from that rather than just blindly taking a framework and saying, hey, this is a framework in the industry. This should be it, right? May not actually work. I mean, it's not also the same for all kinds of developers.
Is it safe to say that at Uber, developer productivity was measured in the sense that there were these, charts, metrics. It showed the diffs per engineer on your team. You could see it and how it changed over time, the time to code review, focus time, etc. But is it safe to say that these were measured with the intention of finding bottlenecks and what to improve, and they were not measured with the intention of using them for performance reviews, promotion, or figuring out who's the low performer? Like, is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, that's the usual controversy. People tend to misuse it. The guidance is always like, look at them at a high level. And that is where a lot of these were aggregated, right? And you can find ways to like disincentivize people from bringing those up, right? Because you can easily catch bias. We had, for example, folks on the performance committee that would be there just to catch bias that, hey, are you just looking at diffs or you're not looking at the quality? And sometimes like people may not have as much output because they have other contributions they're making. They might be writing docs, so they might be like influencing strategy. Yeah. They might be working on like unblocking teams or like figuring out product and business goals and distilling them to like requirements and engineering. So it was definitely like, I think initially people thought of it that way, but that was never the intention, or that was never the case in my experience. At least on all the companies I've been, we never looked at it as like anything more than, hey, it's just good to know that, hey, if you haven't written any PRs, that's a red flag potentially. Like we had 0 PRs in the entire year. Explain yourself. Like, yeah. We will not like, we'll clarify with the manager, hey, what's going on? What are they doing? But we never say that as like a blanket, okay, that means nothing, right? So we always want to use this as a way to say, if there are red flags, we catch it, that there might be something else going on. But it was mostly used for unblocking teams from shipping fast.
Mm. Yeah, so it sounds like it's just like if you have data and you can gather it and that data can actually help you build the right things, I mean, it would be silly not to do it. And as you said, start with the pain points or what people complain about. I mean, we always complain about, well, that was there. Like it was always about code review and how long it took code review to take. And I don't think we ever measured it. I think I left by the time this was there. But if we would have measured it, it would have just really shown that our team was, we probably had our median was probably more than a day because we were waiting a team on the other side of the Atlantic, and then we figured out how to cut those ties. Yeah. And
code is rarely a bottleneck, especially now with like AI tools. You could just generate a bunch of code and throw a PR. Like that's rarely the bottleneck. You're bringing alignment or figuring out product requirements or making sure you're not breaking the experience takes the hardest. So just measuring output in terms of PRs is probably going to be harder as a justifiable thing after this new age of AI tools, because people are just shipping so much more. Like we use a lot of AI tools at work, including our own, and we ship a ton more than we used to back at Uber.
So you're now in the business of AI tools to help engineering productivity and engineers work better. How do you see these tools changing how we do software development? I'm talking obviously about the usual suspects, the coding, autocompletes, the co-pilots, also the agents, and also everything else that's coming.
Yeah, absolutely. So we are very thick in the space. Obviously, the autocomplete is a huge boost because it kind of, in many cases, helps you sort of like type less, but think more. right? So I think if you probably use a bunch of these tools, I do too. It
Yeah.
removes a lot of the grunt work, but it won't remove your thought process, because the taste in what you want to do is still there, just not the how. Sometimes it's like, okay, this makes sense, right? But I feel like a lot of the tools are either focused too much on their completion, or they're only on the code review. I think back from when we learned things at Uber, we had a lot of inefficiencies in things we wished we could like solve with some sort of intelligent layer. Like I was, for example, going and unblocking things. Like, hey, I knew exactly what would need to happen to like unblock a build, or so having some sort of like an agentic understanding of things that are happening in the IDE. Why did you type this character? That affects like what's happening in code review, and that affects what happens on deploy. That affects what happens on like your incident, for example. There is nothing that's cross-cutting. So that's kind of what we are trying to solve with Gitar, is like have this whole SDLC under the purview and not just focus on the point solution of, I'm just an IDE code complete, or I'm just going to be on your CI reviewing stuff. A lot of those solutions currently are, I believe, good starting points. And my experience, like how I've seen technology shifts happen, the much nicer or more important unlocks happen a little bit later into the cycle. Because since we're very early in the cycle with the AI, at this point, people are just experimenting stuff. But I believe that there's a huge value add for agents, just because, as you mentioned, like there are some things that are so obvious when you think about it that, hey, we wish we wrote like a script to automate this, right? For support or for documentation. Those can be potentially driven by agents, but then still have the human in the loop when things need to be approved. And that's kind of how we think about it.
And like as you're using these tools, like how does it change your development? Like obviously we're writing less code because now like there's just more suggestions, or there's also agents. But like what does it allow you to do? Are you just moving faster? Or are you actually having deeper thoughts? I'm just interested in like what it means for you, the current version of these agents that we know where it's a service cycle. We never know how long it'll go, but clearly it's only been like no more than 2 years. So
yeah, I think it allows you to explore more paths that you previously didn't have time to explore, because you could experiment much faster and discard ideas much quicker. Because when you're prototyping, you don't need the full rigor. You can put them behind a flag and then say, hey, this looks good. I think people are calling it vibe coding these days. Like, hey, this has the right vibe. We can experiment with this. Of course, it's harder when you have a lot of other constraints. Like, you have to make sure the software is, secure, compliant. A lot of people are not thinking about that when prototyping, right? So it lets you prototype faster, which is great. And I think what's also happening is, I feel now there's a lot of talk about, hey, junior engineers are going to get replaced. But I think it's the opposite. My take is that junior engineers are going to thrive because they are coming with new knowledge, new ways of working with these tools, and are going to be much more effective because they don't have bias of working a particular way. They're able to like achieve things that, for example, it would take a long time to like even wrap up. Doesn't mean that you shouldn't know the fundamentals. In fact, like if you think about 20 years ago, they had like a DBA and a HTML and like a Java application engineer. There was no data engineer.
And a webmaster sometimes,
and
right?
A webmaster. There was no like SRE.
That job no longer exists.
No. There's no like front-end person. There's no mobile person. There's no like data engineer, ML engineer. There's so many more archetypes now, or like, subcategories. I think with AI, the general engineer is going to see a rise again, which means I'm able to jump into, for example, front end without not doing much front end, because I can understand that, okay, this is what I expect to happen. And I would like to have this outcome with my software, which means I can then focus on the other parts of the problem.
You mentioned vibe coding, and this is a brand new term. What do you think it stands for? Is it just prototyping? Is it just like throwing out ideas, or is it a bit more than that?
I think vibe coding is just you trying to figure out how the system should behave when you're prototyping. The good thing about vibe coding is like you're able to like basically iterate much faster with these agentic loops, that now you're just focusing on how would I actually achieve my outcome rather than the exact way to do it, because you can always change those details later. If you have the right abstractions, you could swap layers out. So I think that's changing the way people think about software, because if you're someone who has taste and knows like this is the outcome I want to see on the UX, you may not even need to know a framework. You should experiment with it till it feels right. And of course, like you need to massage it to make sure it doesn't make it harder to evolve later on. I think a lot of the software today gets you to the initial, it looks great, but then how do you maintain it is basically sort of like left for later time. And I think a lot of people who are still coding with AI are early in the prototype phase. I don't think at enterprise scale that would work, because I can imagine it'll probably mess with your entire abstraction layer you already put in. So you have to like really constrain it to work well. So vibe coding is great for prototyping at this point, but that's also why I think you can move a lot faster with less constraints, because AI has a lot more freedom to explore.
One of the like problems that we're seeing, and if you're using it, you'll also see is like there's this Adi Osmani called it the 70% problem, that like vibe coding and these things that they get you started, but then it can get just really confused and stuck, and people see this, like people who are not really technical, they kind of get stuck, and that's where experienced engineers really shine. You said previously that you think junior engineers will do great there. How do you think less experienced engineers can deal with this? That's one. And then the other is is this where we might see, senior engineers actually, thrive and spend more of their time?
Yeah, I think the main differentiator there is like when things go wrong, understanding why they went wrong, which means strong CS fundamentals, strong sort of system knowledge of, hey, how does the entire thing work end to end? So senior engineers usually tend to have a better, bigger picture. So if they adopt these new tools, actually, they can get a lot more productive. I can tell from my own experience that adopting these tools, I'm able to get a lot more stuff done, because I know, for example, this is how I expect my system to work, which means I can delegate to, I used to give it to like a more junior person to like, understand the system. Now I can just give it to AI and I can check the work and I can commit it. But if you're very stuck in the base and not want to use these tools, you can still do it. It's going to be a lot slower, and that's totally fine too. It's just a matter of like how quickly you want to ship. And for things that are not critical, you may want to still experiment to see what's out there, because the way they're going, the tools are getting better every day, which means over time, a lot of the mistakes that are happening today will start to disappear. There'll be like other agents that will check the work of the first agent, so they're not going to be as many mistakes. You still want to have a human in the loop before you check in. Otherwise, you will not have full guarantee that whatever you're shipping to the user is going to be good. But you definitely want senior engineers to focus on the high-level, system-level knowledge, and the agentic loops can be more nuanced and like more focused on smaller parts of the puzzle.
After nine years of Uber working on developer experience, you've now co-founded a company called Gitar. How are you thinking about continuing this developer experience? And also, what's your approach to AI? What are your bets on where the space is going to go?
Yeah, that's a good question. So when we co-founded Gitar with my co-founders Ali and Raj, we basically saw that a lot of the inefficiencies we had, tools were not available back in the day at Uber, we solved because we had a golden path for developers. Now with agents, I think we talked about Devpods previously, right? Like, hey, there's a golden path for a developer to get stuff done. So what if an agent had a golden path to get things done for a particular enterprise? So we're thinking of Gitar, like the agents we're building at Gitar. We just are going to launch a new product pretty soon. And you can check us out at gitar.ai. The agentic AI we build is actually inside the IDE, on the code review system, inside your deployment. It's across the board. So there's no reason why you can't autocomplete like a deployment shop and not just be stuck inside IDE, right? And having an understanding of things like, hey, how are things going in production? Which part of the code is slow? These dots are usually what engineers connect, right? The context is what flows through your brain. And if there's a standardized path for an agent to like evolve software and maintain it, it becomes much easier to focus on the business value. And one of the things that people dread doing is, hey, maintaining stuff like updating libraries or fixing tech debt or adding coverage. We feel like a lot of that grunt work can be done very efficiently with agents. So that's where our focus is. Like, we don't want to be just like a code complete or within your point solution. We want to have it across the entire stack of software development. And we have that experience working on this for many years, talking to peers in the industry. There's a lot of potential for disrupting the space. And the stuff we wish we had, where, hey, I wish someone was on call during this time to fix a small thing, we can make that happen now, because we can give the agent powers to like unblock people when you might be asleep, which means you'll be on call less often. So we're thinking of it from a holistic developer experience standpoint, and producing more code is just one part of it. It's about doing it reliably, maintaining it, and making it understandable so newer developers can understand what's going on. Because if you just let AI run amok on your code base and not have an idea of what's going on, then that's a recipe for disaster. So we feel like there's a lot of opportunity for making the entire experience end-to-end much more standardized, so that the golden path for developers and agents is like really well laid out.
Now, like, when I'm listening to this, like, one part of me is like, if I'm a business owner, I'm like, oh, that sounds great, because over time I might just have less developers because I'll have a really capable agent. And as a developer, like, obviously one thing that pops into your head is like, wow, like, we might have a smaller team. Hopefully I'll still be there, but I might have fewer colleagues, or, I might be the unfortunate one to get the cut. Like, let's just run with this, that this future is coming and we will have a lot more capable agents. In this case, what do you think developers will do, and what are skill sets that are worth investing in so that you will still be an efficient, a great developer in the future? Seen as a highly efficient developer 10 years from now, your managers will be like, oh my God, like we cannot do work without this person. We need this person here, and we should probably give them a raise because they're underpaid.
Yeah, I think, as you said, there might be less people in a business, but there'll be more businesses, right? That's typically how a lot of these technology shifts go. If building software is easy, then the value unlock will be in like actually the taste and the experience for the end user. Like, what do we actually provide? If every website looks the same because you prototyped it in like a website builder, then that's not going to be your differentiator, right? Like, even I think during the mobile era, a lot of apps came up to do things like to-do lists, or like reminders, or like just scrolling social media. But then eventually some clients have great UX, they won out because they're just a joy to use. So knowing what matters to your end customer is going to be a differentiator for engineers to like hone in on. So that means understanding the business really well, right? And then the other thing is like, how do you build something for scale? Essentially, as you like grow the business, you don't need as many engineers probably, and that's okay. And that might be fine, because if you're at a smaller company with lesser number of engineers, if you have equity, for example, you might have more of the pie, which means that's a good way to kind of incentivize people to experiment with more ideas. And usually competition is good in that way, right? So you may not be bound by those restrictions that you have to always be like a big company. I think we'll start seeing smaller, more efficient teams who are going to be more productive and will deeply understand the product. And that's going to be, I think, a good way to like compete with other products in that space. Like the taste, the art that goes into like crafting great UX or great end user experiences is going to matter more than how you wrote the code, right?
Mm-hmm. Now, if I'm thinking, because I think it's a good bit to think back that, for example, even 15 years ago, we already had this, right? Like WhatsApp at 50, they were barely at 50 people when Facebook acquired them for $19 billion, which is crazy. This was no AI, no nothing, but clearly they were a very efficient team. Instagram, I think 12 or 13 people. Also, they built an app that was already 30 million users with that small. Like, even today, that would be a big deal. So it's like to get that skill set of you being able to, as an engineer, being able to do a lot with these tools with the small team. You mentioned taste, you mentioned art. What other things that are worth focusing on that should probably help, like do a lot more with less?
Yeah, I think having an understanding of the system layer is good. So I think the scalability part we didn't cover. So how does your app or software scale to more users? What parts of the system are less efficient, more efficient? Because all code might do the same things, but less or more efficiently.
Yeah.
And how do you maintain it, right? So that's the other challenge a lot of people run into as the software systems grow. Is it easy to upgrade because you have less external dependencies? Is it harder because you have so many versions? The software might work the same today, but okay, 3 years down the line, if you can't upgrade and move faster, your competition is going to basically move faster than you because they started on a clean slate. We see that all the time. I think there's a lot of legacy technology or database systems. People are trying to move to modern systems. It's a big cost, right? And that's very expensive. A lot of engineering time wasted. So if building for basically maintainability is going to be important as well, right? And building for like either AI agent maintainability or human understanding. so that you don't have to look at outdated docs or do an expensive migration. For example, if I could wave a magic wand and move all my micro repos to Monorepo and everything just worked, that'd be awesome. I don't think any system can do that today yet.
Yeah.
Maybe it would in the future. But if that's a reality because you designed your software to move that way, that's great. Right? So having that knowledge is not, because AI agents are fundamentally based on expert knowledge, right? So if your knowledge is like understanding of your entire business, because they can't really tell you how should you write your code for your end user, right? What matters to one business may not matter to the other, right? Some parts of the software might work well for one segment, but not work so well for the other segment. So really understanding those business values will differentiate just AI-driven code versus how do you actually use that code to make your business like actually thrive.
So again, it might not happen, right? Or not, or it might happen slower than we expect, etc. But what I'm hearing is like, even if it does happen, having expert knowledge helps. Having taste and you kind of get taste from seeing things or failing things. So is it safe to say that it's probably a pretty good strategy to try your best to go and work at companies that are either building stuff at scale or they just have kind of taste? They're startups that are known to do these things, so that you can build up one of the muscles of like scale, taste, if you can switch between them, because in the future, I assume that some of the kind of repeated, like the successful people who have a pattern will probably have the pattern of like, oh, they worked at companies that kind of did pretty groundbreaking stuff at their time. And now that we have these tools, well, yeah, they're doing even more groundbreaking stuff, and they probably built a bunch of their experience.
Yeah, the experience matters a lot. Like knowing a lot of the stack helps. Like when I was at Uber, I didn't do much work on front end, but now I'm at Gitar. I'm doing like front end, I'm doing infra, I'm doing a bunch of stuff, and I'm using agents to help me. Like we use our own agent to like rewrite a bunch of our stuff. And I was like, okay, now I understand why this works that way. I'm a general engineer now. I have strong fundamentals, let's say. I can see the system. I know this is how it's supposed to work. Now I've up-leveled myself without spending. It's kind of like that Matrix movie where Neo gets that, upgrade to like no kung fu.
Yeah.
But it doesn't mean that he can beat the master yet, like he still has to train up and understand it.
Yeah, I like that. So with that, let's go with some rapid questions. I'll just shoot out some things, and then you go. What is your favorite programming language and why?
Rust.
Rust. Since when?
Yeah, since Gitar actually. I was like initially like, oh my god, Rust has a bad reputation for being hard, but it makes things so safe. It's hard to have, I think, like outages if you design it right. I mean, you can still have them, but like you can really understand the type safety is there to help you out. And you start treating it like your friend, then it unlocks a lot of stuff for you.
And so this is coming from someone who's you've spent a lot in Java and Go, right? Like you've probably spent like half your career in those.
Yeah, it's funny because when I graduated college, I told my friends I would never work in a company that does Java, and then I did Java for 9 years. So, never say never.
What's an AI-powered dev tool that you use and like?
We use our own agentic thing quite a bit. We call it Jimmy, which is a new agentic. Jimmy, yeah, because Gitar,
Yeah.
We use Cursor as well for like, the autocomplete, but we feel like Jimmy gives a lot more end-to-end stuff for us. So we've been using it pretty heavily, but you can also try it out hopefully soon. And then I use a bunch of other smaller, like Claude directly, obviously, for question and answer stuff. How to play with like some of the newer DeepSeek research and models and stuff like that, because I've been hearing good things about them for more deeper work, but haven't had a chance yet.
And what's a book that you'd recommend?
My favorite book, I don't read too much, but I read this book early in my career called Head First Design Patterns, which is a little old at this point, but the patterns are really good because it really makes you understand how you can layer things. A lot of software today is just abstraction over abstraction over abstraction, if you think about them. So it really helps you understand what pattern makes sense when, and when to use it, how to transition between them. I would highly recommend that. If you're trying to go into like a more systems level approach and want to design software for maintainability, that's very crucial. Making it pluggable, composable, and like replaceable under the hood. Like a lot of the migrations we did at Uber was zero downtime with like no code freeze. when we did the Java migration, there was no code freeze. So that was a crowning achievement. Yeah.
Yeah, and it banks these days still, like they will shut down their thing for some migration for like a whole day on the weekend in 2025. So it's a big difference, as you say. Well, Gautam, I really enjoyed this conversation. It was good to reconnect and just see how developer productivity, empowering developers, you're still like just running with it.
Yeah, I think this is the area I love, like working in this area. I can't see myself doing anything else. I've been doing it for 10 years. I hope to do it for 10 more. We'll see. But I hope I can make more developers productive.
I hope you also found this episode about Uber's internal tools, developer productivity, and AI's impact on software engineering as interesting as I did. You can find Gautam on social media as linked in the show notes below, and check out his company Gitar at gitar.ai. For more deep dives on Uber's engineering culture, check out the Pragmatic Engineer articles linked in the show notes below. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please do subscribe on your favorite podcast platform and on YouTube. This helps more people discover the podcast, and a special thank you if you leave a rating. Thanks, and see you in the next one.